Well, welcome everyone to this session on what field supervisors need to know about wild and scenic rivers. My name is Steve Chesterton. I'm with the U.S. Forest Service, currently serving as acting director for wilderness and wild and scenic rivers out of our Washington office in D.C. But my position of record is as Wild and Scenic Rivers National Program Manager. And I've been with the staff for about 15 years now. Most of which I've also served on the Interagency Wild and Scenic Rivers Coordinating Council, which we'll talk about a little bit more later if you're not familiar with that group. So with that, I'll turn it over to Susan to introduce herself a little more.
Hi, I'm Susan Cook. I'm the superintendent for Homestead National Historical Park in Beatrice, Nebraska, so southeast corner. I was previously, just moved here in October, but prior to that, for the last 5 years, I was a superintendent for Niobrara National Scenic River in Valentine, Nebraska, north central Nebraska. I'm also a member of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Steering Committee for the National Park Service. So I'll just keep it short and sweet. Now turn it over to Monica.
Hi, I'm Monica Zimmerman. As Risa said, I'm an outdoor recreation planner with the Bureau of Land Management in Southeast Idaho and have been doing that for over 26 years. I'm also one of the field representatives on the Interagency Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Council. And so just look forward to this conversation today.
Yeah, thanks, Monica. Thanks, Susan. So the goals for this session today are fourfold. Really, as the name of the session implies, where the target audience are decision makers at a field level across any agency, likely not river specialists, although may have a background, but really providing an overview of wild and scenic river management implications under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act at a broad level, an introductory level, and then also introduce some core competencies that have been developed for river management non-specialists with management of wild and scenic rivers in mind. And then we really hope this will be an interactive session. So appreciate your participation. We want to promote some dialogue through some activities and questions, and hopefully some responses as well. And then lastly, we want you to walk away from today with some resources that are available to you for future reference as more questions and situations might come before you related to wild and scenic rivers. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Monica.
Great. Thank you, Steve. I wanted to start out this discussion before we start diving into kind of overview aspects of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. I wanted to highlight the core competencies and how your experience can relate to the core competencies or how you have the ability to gain more experience. So the Interagency Wild and Scenic River Council Coordinating Council developed some core competencies, and basically it helps identify what is needed to implement river management stewardship law, regulation, and policy at 3 different levels of expertise for different groups of employees. And so in our discussion, like Steve said, we're going to focus in on non-specialists, but the core competencies is set up to identify what the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are needed for non-specialists. And these competencies are intended to be applied to federally designated wild and scenic rivers or even non-designated rivers managed by the federal agencies or the partnership rivers. And as I mentioned, we're going to correlate our discussion today focused on river management non-specialists. And so these are employees having varying levels of river management responsibilities, but whose primary duty is not river management. So it's those supervisors, superintendents over where you may have a wild and scenic river. The core competency document, it's identified for non-specialists, but there's also levels of expertise. So for non-specialized specialists, there would be a recognition level. So these are the KSAs needed to convey or implement basic river management principles, or there's the coordination level, which are the KSAs needed to develop interdisciplinary solutions to river management, or the leadership level, which these are the KSAs needed for making river management decisions. And the core competencies helps lay that out. And the core competencies identifies 8 competency areas. And so what's on the screen, can you see all of those 8 competency areas?
Yep.
Okay. So those are the 8 competencies areas identified in the core competencies document. And so the reason why I asked what your experience was or is with Wild and Scenic Rivers is because finding out you may already have knowledge related to some of these core competencies areas, or for those of you that had identified none, you want to learn, or you know that you need to gain knowledge to help you learn more about wild and scenic river management or river management in general. And so the core competencies document is split out with these 8 items. And so you can start to look at this and identify, hey, if I want to become more competent in management of wild and scenic rivers, and I need to learn more about the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act history, law, regulation, and policy. Whereas I may already have knowledge about field skills and planning. So it's a tool for you to reference as you continue in your career and learn more. Starting with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was passed October 2nd of 1968 by President Johnson. And this act established the National Wild and Scenic Rivers System. And with the enactment of that law, 8 rivers were initially designated, and 27 rivers were identified for additional study for potential addition to the system. Once the act was established, I'm going to turn it over to Susan, and she's going to cover what rivers we have designated and designated.
So the designated rivers that we have are the Middle Fork of Clearwater in Idaho, managed by the U.S. Forest Service. 11 Point in Missouri with the Forest Service. The Middle Fork of the Feather in California, also managed by the U.S. Forest Service. The Rio Grande in New Mexico with Bureau of Land Management. The Rogue River in Oregon, Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service. St. Croix in Minnesota and Wisconsin, which is the National Park Service. Middle Fork of the Salmon in Idaho with U.S. Forest Service, and the Wolf River in Wisconsin, which is part of the National Park Service also, or managed by them. So when you look at this map, you can see that currently, all the different rivers, but there's less than 0.4% of the river miles in the United States are currently wild and scenic rivers. So you can just see how special they have to be to have this designation, and how special that they are for us to be managing and protecting for the future. This image shows all the rivers in the United States, rivers that have been dammed, dredged, or channelized, and rivers designated as wild and scenic. The blue shows all the rivers, about 3.5 million miles. The orangish red color shows rivers in the United States that have been dammed, dredged, or channelized, which is about 860,000 miles. The rivers shown in yellow are designated as the Wild and Scenic River, totaling 13,467. So not a big chunk of the 3.5 million. So the Wild and Scenic Rivers are administered by the Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, and the United States Forest Service. While these agencies all have their own regulations and policies and guidance, for the Wild and Scenic River Management, they also coordinate with each other to administer the Wild and Scenic Rivers area across the system, therefore improving the service to the American public and enhancing protection of important river resources. Steve referenced that group earlier, which we'll learn more about later. Now I'll turn it over to Steve.
Thanks, Susan. So for the remainder of the session, we're going to really use the various key sections of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act to form the structure of talking about, learning about what it means to manage a wild and scenic river. And starting with Section 1, which lays out Congress's declaration of policy of why it passed the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act and was signed into law by President Johnson. You can see the language here. It's a long sentence, but it's packed with a lot of key information and intent, really focused on, certain selected rivers possessing outstandingly remarkable scenic, recreational, geologic, fish, wildlife, historic, cultural, other similar values. What you'll learn are we're now referred to as outstandingly remarkable values, preserved in their free-flowing condition, and in particular protected for the benefit and enjoyment of present and future generations. So it's focused on both now and in perpetuity, for their protection, but also for use and enjoyment. And so as we move forward to the next slide and the next part of this original section 1 of the Act. So it really goes into even greater detail on why the nation set up this system, passed this law. It came out of an era of dam construction and channelization and use of rivers for a variety of means, but recognizing that approach to utilizing rivers should be complemented with a system that protects rivers in their free-flowing condition and also protects water quality. And in 1968, when the law was passed, that predates the modern Clean Water Act. So this was sort of the original system established across the nation for protecting rivers. And it did establish, as Monica mentioned earlier, and Susan showed you the map of this national wild and scenic river system, which started with the original 8 designations that Susan identified, and it has now grown to 228 designations, that 13,000 plus miles that was pictured on the previous slide. And so it's intended to, be a growing system to support the intent of the Act. Next slide. So really at the core of the Act is about protecting and enhancing river values, and some of those things that were key terms that were referenced earlier, that free-flowing condition, protection of water quality, those outstandingly remarkable values that are unique for each designated river. Collectively, we refer to those 3 categories of values as river values. And the overarching intent of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is to protect and enhance those values. That's the key mandate in managing the National Wild and Scenic River System and protecting each designated wild and scenic river. So as we go in a little bit further into these, I'll pass it over to Susan.
So we're going to talk about the river values next in a little bit more detail. So free flowing is a condition, one of the 3 river values identified for the protection of under the Wild and Scenic River Act. So free flowing condition is an important concept that comes directly from the Section 1B of the Act. Section 1B states that selected rivers shall be preserved in their free-flowing condition to protect the water quality of such rivers. As one of the 3 primary river values identified for protection, understanding what is considered free-flowing is crucial to the Wild and Scenic River study and management. It is not, as you first might think, as the same as naturally flowing or flowing in a manner unimpaired by human activity. The Act itself defines the term free-flowing in Section 16B. This definition is, as applied to any river or section of a river, means existing or flowing in a natural condition without impoundment, diversion, straightening, riprapping, or other modifications of the waterway. The existence, however, of low dams, diversion works, and other minor structures at any time in any river is proposed for inclusion in the National Wild and Scenic Rivers shall not be automatically barred from consideration. They can have them there as they're designated, and that does not mean that they can be added onto. So it further says they can be there upon inclusion, provided that this shall not be as construed to authorize, intend, or encourage future construction of such structures within components of the National Wild and Scenic Rivers system. So it's important to note that they can have those structures at the time of designation, but that doesn't mean you can keep adding to it. So it's also important to know what free-flowing means, because it's the base of all of your decisions in the future. Water quality is another of the river values identified for protection under Section 1B of the Act. Again, the Act states that selected rivers shall be preserved in their free-flowing condition to protect the water quality of such rivers. So it's really important to develop a comprehensive river quality program, or a water quality program. Baselines are a starting point for us to compare and to see what changes. And if you aren't doing them on a regular basis, you might miss something that's changing. And so the goal is to do it often, to minimize damage when you see that there's something or a reason for issues. It gives the managers scientific data to support mitigation needs when working with the partners and the landowners. At my river that I worked on previously, we worked very closely with our landowners along the river. Some actually requested assistance in monitoring water quality. And in one instance, it became so important to us because staff found a high E. coli at the mouth of the creek from that landowner's river. And because we were working with him, we were able to work with him to go and see, because it's private property, you can't just go up it if you want to. But because we worked with this landowner, we did go up along that creek to find out what was causing it, and there was a dead cow that was in the creek. So remove it, you fix your water quality. You know, if we didn't pay attention, I don't know how long it would have been impacting the river itself. So having those relationships is imperative to being able to address issues like this quickly and easily without having, fights with people, things like that. So the third river value is outstanding remarkable values, or ORVs. Section 1B of the Act identifies the river-related values which qualify it as an ORV. These values include scenic, recreational, geologic, fish and wildlife, historic, cultural, and other similar values. The category called other similar values is not defined by the Act. However, the category has been interpreted to include resources such as botany, hydrology, paleontology, things along that line. So ORVs are unique to Wild and Scenic Rivers. As a new superintendent, I did not learn about what ORV meant right away, and it's something I wish I would have known to ask, because when you're working on that river, you need to know exactly what your ORVs are. So it's important to know what they are and ensure that you're protecting the right things. And it's a very different wording than traditional national park sites. So it's a whole new learning category if you've been in other sites. So this is an important question to ask as a new a manager of a park or other site. So you can review and learn and see what makes your river very special.
Thanks, Susan. So there are also provisions in the Act that not only focus on rivers once they're designated, but also looking towards future designations and evaluating the potential of non-designated rivers for future designation. And that's laid out through what we call a study process. Those rivers can be identified for study by Congress. Congress can mandate to a federal agency to study particular rivers, evaluate their potential for future designation, or each federal agency can identify and evaluate rivers through their own planning processes. In either case, there's sort of the same steps involved to look at whether a river, one, is eligible, which involves looking at whether it's in a free-flowing condition and has one or more of those outstandingly remarkable values that Susan just talked about. And then if it is, then look at what we'll talk about in a second, the preliminary classification of the river, and then ultimately whether it's suitable for designation, whether in essence, is wild and scenic river designation the best tool for protecting those river values identified? Is that, should it be added to the national system in the future? And even if an agency goes through that whole process, finds a river eligible, gives a preliminary classification, finds it suitable, that does not mean it is actually designated. It just means that it's completed the study process. And often there are interim management requirements to ensure protection of those river values until Congress acts and ultimately decides whether the river should be designated and added to the national system. So I referenced the preliminary classification as part of the study process. When a river is designated, it does receive a classification. It's one of the more confusing parts of the National Wild and Scenic River System, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, that we have these three classifications established under the Act: wild, scenic, and recreational. Those terms don't actually relate to the specific river values or the specific ORVs that have been identified for the particular river, but instead they refer to essentially the level of development and access within and along the particular river segment, with wild rivers being the least developed and recreational being the most developed. So generally, wild river segments are only accessible by trail, versus scenic river segments might be accessible in a few places with roads or have railroads crossing, for instance. Recreational rivers, often there's a publicly accessible road or even highway right along the river within the river corridor. And same goes for the other type of development you might see in a river corridor. There might be homes or other structures within a recreational corridor versus a wild corridor, often, but not exclusively, might be in a designated wilderness area. Those classifications also relate to how minerals and mineral leasing laws apply within wild corridors. There's actually a withdrawal from mining and mineral leasing within a quarter mile of each side of the river, versus scenic and recreational. There's no statutory withdrawal, automatic withdrawal under the Wild Scenic Rivers Act, although there can still be administrative withdrawals subject to valid existing rights. In all cases, no matter which classification, the objective and requirement under the Act is for river administering agencies to manage to that classification level going forward. So it would be inconsistent with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, say, for a wild classified river to have developments occur within that river corridor that would be more appropriate in the scenic or recreational corridor. So those classification levels are the levels at which the rivers are managed going forward. And so ultimately, we talked about classification. We talked earlier about the study process. If a river is designated, there's actually two means by which that can occur. The primary means is by an act of Congress, and each act of Congress to designate a river amends the original Wild and Scenic Rivers Act to add that particular designated river's description in the act itself. So that's primarily how rivers are designated, through an act of Congress, law signed by the president. But there is a second way in which rivers can be designated, and that's where a river is protected under a state-based system, and then the governor of that state makes a request to the Secretary of Interior to add the river to the National Wild and Scenic River System. I believe one of the more recent examples of that is the Housatonic River in Connecticut back in 2016. So there's 17 of those rivers designated by the Secretary of Interior versus the 2000 or 211 that were designated by Congress. I think I got my math right there. So once a river is designated, there's a requirement to develop a comprehensive river management plan. There's a lot of gray area under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act about how to achieve that protect and enhance mandate for river values, how to manage consistent with the classification system, the classification identified for each river segment. The comprehensive river management planning process is the tool used to really lay out how that river will be managed as a wild and scenic river, and really tailored to the specifics of that river and its corridor. It's part of that process. Often this is the development of the final boundary for a corridor, which is usually a quarter mile on each side of the river. But ultimately, through the final boundary process, it can be tailored to the specific river values in certain locations, so that in some cases it could be narrower, and in some cases it could be a wider corridor, again, to meet the specific needs of that particular designation. So on the next slide, Monica is going to talk a little bit more about the collaborative approach associated with comprehensive river management plans, or CRMPs.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So far, Susan and Steve have been going through the key sections of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and our intent of this presentation was to provide you with some of that basic knowledge, or maybe this might be review for some of you, of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And so this ties back to the competency areas where, remember when we first started, the river management specialists as well as non-specialists must demonstrate varying levels of skill in competency areas. And so far we have been highlighting aspects or trying to provide information related to the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, a little bit of the history, laws, regulations, and policies. And Susan and Steve also talked about other relevant laws, policies, and tools for river management. So hitting on those first two competency areas. And so with the Comprehensive River Management Plan, it really hits at the competency area 3, which is river management planning. And as Steve mentioned, this is a requirement of the Act to, if you have a designated wild and scenic river, that a comprehensive river management plan is developed for that river corridor. And as you can see on this slide, what goes into the development of a CRMP has many different aspects to it, where we need to, it's a collaborative approach. And so as Susan was mentioning, we may be working with partners on a specific river, especially if there's a lot of private land ownership or state ownership. In this planning effort, we're required to describe the river values. So what are those existing resource conditions? And what is a detailed description of the outstanding remarkable values? Also in this process is when we would identify goals and desired conditions for river values. We'd also address development of lands and facilities. We also need to address user capacities. So looking at the types and amount of use that the river corridor that is sustainable. Also, we need to address water quality issues or in-stream flow requirements related to a designated river, and identify other regulatory authorities of other government agencies to assist with protecting the river management values, which we identify through this process. And we also want to identify a monitoring strategy to maintain desired conditions. So there's a lot of different aspects here that is required of us to look at when developing a CRMP. And all of these items also tie back to the competency areas, which some of us may have very strong skills in field skills or visitor use management and monitoring, where we may be able to develop our user capacity based on our existing knowledge. Or if we have limited knowledge, we may need to learn that we need to develop more understanding or skills of how to manage visitor use. Okay, the next, continuing with looking at different sections of the Wild and Scenic River Act, Section 10 is a critical section of the Act. And this is where it mandates to manage the free-flowing condition, water quality, and the outstanding remarkable values, or ORVs. And it provides the core principles and standards for federal agencies when administering wild and scenic rivers. Section 10 is also cited as the non-degradation or enhancement policy. And also Section 10A directs federal agencies to administer wild and scenic rivers to protect and enhance values for which a river was designated. Section 10B, this is the section of the Act that addresses how Wild and Scenic River Act provisions relate to designated wilderness areas. And the designated river would be subject to both the Wilderness Act as well as the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And however, if there's conflict between the different provisions, the most restrictive provision of either act would apply for area-specific management.
So managers can assist, it's the collaborative aspect, and we're going to talk a bit more about this with setting up protections. So managers can assist the community in protecting the viewshed of the river. And you do that through county zoning commissions because they create the regulations. We don't. They create them, but we can help. And what I found is sometimes they didn't, working with different counties, they don't realize their own authority to make these regulations because they just take whatever the Wild and Scenic River Act says. But they really need to pay attention to what they really want to protect. That's the end goal. What are you trying to protect? An example of this is in one of the counties that I worked with, the landowners and commissioners really got upset because there was a cabin all of a sudden built in view of the river. And what the county didn't realize, it was that this was outside of the setbacks, but they could have created a larger setback. But it wasn't that wasn't on their mind as they were creating their county regulations. So it's really important to work with them and help them answer questions, have a relationship with them so you can have these conversations so they can understand what they can do to assist the Wild and Scenic River Act in protecting the river and its surroundings. So it's important to note that we don't make those regulations, but we can assist in writing them, protect the areas around the river.
So the next section we're going to look at is Section 7, which is protecting free flow. And really, this is oftentimes considered the teeth of the Wild and Scenic River Act because this contains the features designed to protect rivers from harmful effects of hydropower or different types of water resource projects in general. So some key points of Section 7 of the Act is that Section 7 prohibits the licensing of new hydropower facilities. Some examples could include dams or water diversions, bridge crossings, boat ramps, channelizing the river. Section 7 requires a written assessment of how a proposed project would affect river-related values, including free-flowing condition, outstanding remarkable values, and water quality. It requires that the river administrating agencies evaluate a project and make the Section 7 determination. And the outcome of the Section 7 determination controls whether or not the federal agency could permit, fund, or assist with that project. Steve talked a little bit about river classifications, but river classifications has no effect on Section 7 determination. The standards are not lower for projects on segments classified as recreational versus segments that are either classified as scenic or wild. It's really looking at the protection of the river is provided regardless of the classification. And turn it over to Susan for an example of addressing Section 7.
So Section 7 is a really big learning curve. So as a manager, you'll be involved in working on bridges and other infrastructures involving your river. My philosophy is always to try to respond as quickly as possible and make things as drama-free as possible. So you're not holding up a project or a process. So this bridge that you see in this picture was my first 7A that I worked on as a superintendent. And I would have been lost if it hadn't been for my regional Wild Scenic River coordinators. So always make sure you know who they are, and they're very helpful in wanting to work with you. But it's vital to get to know that person. This bridge had a lot of drama, which could have been much worse if we hadn't responded quickly to the design process. 1/3 of this bridge was taken out by an ice jam during a bomb cyclone. The design was shared with me almost a year before the formal 7A determination would have come. The design included 5 60-foot metal pylons going out into the active channel to protect the new abutment that was also going into the active channel of the river, which obviously is against the free-flowing condition. The river was trying to move to the other side of where the abutment was going to be, so we also knew that Mother Nature would take this bridge out again, because she'd already taken it out 3 times in the last 40 years. So a solution to address both issues was to lengthen the bridge by 150 feet, which would put the abutment on solid ground, and the metal pylons would no longer be needed. And it also didn't need to have hard armoring along the bank that was proposed. So it was contentious at first because I guess my first thought, I was new, and when you say no to a design, you stop a bridge building. That had not equated into my head yet, but it also got us moving in the right direction really fast. So it was the same people that it was contentious with became some of my closest allies, and we worked very closely in working on things together. So it's important that to address things like this as soon as the design is seen to limit, process, it would have extended the bridge build a year if we hadn't reacted quickly to it. And it's better to work collaboratively. And so the takeaway of this scenario is to respond quickly, be creative and collaborative, and look for many different solutions to find out which one is going to work best for everyone. Anyway, the bridge is actually just being finished building right now. And this last winter, side note, the temporary bridge was taken out by ice.
Sections 10 and 11 are sections of the Act that are related to cooperation and partnership. Section 10 is related to water quality and water quantity. And Susan, did you want to give a quick example of that before we get to the wrap-up slide?
So many times we're not going to own all the land around our river, so it's important that we work collaboratively with these landowners. One of the best ways we found in making sure that things are done properly, like bank stabilization, other things, is education with the landowners. And it's the first and best way of mitigating future problems. So one tool that our park created was a landowner guide, which had basic information and who to contact for help. Another tool that we have is cooperative agreements, which can be used to have other people do work on our behalf, which is really great when you have private landowners, but other organizations that can help you, such as monitoring the resources like water quality and the ORVs. They can also do invasive species removal, things like that. These 2 pictures show examples of one of them is on the left. It's a partnership with the state of Nebraska Game and Parks and the NPS, where we were installing an accessible canoe launch. And the other one is the Middle Niobrara Natural Resource District and the National Park Service installing a beach mat to see if we could fix a couple of problems with a landing to make it easier for people to get in and out. So there's so many ways to work with each other, and that's kind of the ultimate goal is collaboration. And we used to hold an annual meeting with our federal partners in the area just so we could see how we can help each other help our local landowners.
Thanks everyone for joining us today. Did want to leave you with some information going forward. In particular, rivers.gov is the key website managed by the Interagency Wild and Scenic Rivers Coordinating Council, which Monica and I mentioned earlier, where agency representatives, representatives from each of the 4 federal river administering agencies, and that council has been around since 1995 to promote consistent understanding and management of the National Wild and Scenic River System. Certainly wanted to highlight the River Training Center and our partnership with RMS, who of course is helping put it on the National Wilderness Skills Institute, but also lots of other training resources available both virtually and in person. In particular, the video series that there was an earlier session today on, highlighting in quick 3-4 minute videos some of the key information about managing a designated river if you're brand new to it and want to learn more. That's a great video series. And then lastly, I also wanted to highlight the nationwide rivers inventory that was recently updated. It's managed by the Park Service, but includes information from across the U.S. That both federal agencies as well as non-federal entities evaluating rivers for free-flowing condition and their potential of having one or more RVs. So sort of an inventory of potentially future designations, depending on, again, those acts of Congress or designations by the Secretary of Interior. So another great resource to go to learn more about rivers that are not currently designated. That's our contact information on the screen. And thanks again for joining.